The Thousand Sons are a legion of sorcerers led by the demon Primarch Magnus the Red, and are by far one of the coolest Warhammer 40k armies that you can field on the tabletop. There are a couple different ways you can run these guys, from running mobs of Zangor demons to legions of relentless rubric marines. This elite army hits hard and takes command over the battlefield using ritual casting and devastating spells and firepower. We're going to go over the lore of the 15th Legion and how they got to be the dusty boys they are today. We're going to go over how I personally run my Thousand Sons and some shenanigans you can get into on the tabletop. Welcome back to Starhammer. The 15th Legion, or the Thousand Sons, was a Space Marine Legion sired from the gene seed of Primarch Magnus the Red, an incredibly potent psyker with only the Emperor himself more powerful than he. As the Thousand Sons waged the Great Crusade, Magnus and his legions scoured all the worlds they conquered for all sorts of forbidden and arcane knowledge. Problems would soon arise, however. The Great Crusade is meant to expel superstition and magic from human belief, yet the Thousand Sons and their Primarch embodied what the Emperor was trying to destroy. On top of that, tensions were growing between Magnus and the Space Wolves Primarch Leman Russ. Russ viewed the Thousand Sons and Magnus as cowardly tricksters and dangerous, as often the populations of worlds conquered by the 15th Legion were left enthralled by the Thousand Sons. And when it came to danger, he wasn't lying. While the Thousand Sons were quite dangerous in combat, it was their mutations that posed a risk to themselves and everyone around them. You see, the Thousand Sons Battle Brothers suffered from extensive mutation due to their long exposure to the Empyrean, known as the Flesh Change. After so much exposure to the warp, one of them would just snap and go in a killing frenzy and had to be put down by the others in the Legion. They mutated into this gibbering mass of limbs and grossness that would later come to be known as Chaos Spawn. As the Thousand Sons waged the Great Crusade, the use of psychic powers in their warfare became the subject of increased scrutiny. Several Primarchs began to question why such psychic space marines were allowed in the Astartes when the entire point of the Crusade was to rid the galaxy of sorcery and superstition, as we mentioned before. This eventually culminated in the Council of Nicaea. By this time, a great number of Battle Brothers of the 15th Legion had been afflicted by the Flesh Change. Those that weren't saw their powers increase more the more they were exposed to the warp. Both of these raised alarms within the Astartes legions. The Imperial Fists, Raven Guard, and Death Guard eventually took their concerns about this to the Emperor himself. They demanded that the Thousand Sons be stricken from Imperial records and expelled from the Astartes due to their increasingly dangerous nature. The Emperor also had concerns over Magnus and his legions. As the Great Crusade progressed and more planets were brought into Imperial compliance, distrust and outright hatred of Psykers had only increased. With Psykers having previously wreaked havoc on worlds before they were brought into the Imperium, the Astartes themselves joined in on the general consensus that Psykers were a problem and needed to go, and the Emperor understood that while the Thousand Sons were a loyal and successful legion, their continued use of psychic abilities stood in stark contrast to the goals of the Crusade. And so the Emperor and every Primarch and several high-ranking Imperial officials gathered on Nicaea finally addressed the issue of allowing Psykers into the legions. Magnus argued that while the utilization of psychic powers could be dangerous, the track record of success his legion maintained in bringing worlds under the Emperor's banner, many of which through non-violence, thanks to these psychic abilities, was more than enough justification for the continued harnessing of the Empyrean. Magnus said, quote, "Many have spoken of the evils of the Psyker, the sorcerer, and the witch, that the art is intrinsically wrong simply because it can be used to perform terrible deeds. I say that one must instead consider that this evil is a projection of the fears of the many who do not understand the possibilities that await mankind if we can tame the dangers of this art. That it is this multitude of lesser sins that is the real issue for this council." It is important to remember that Magnus wasn't just fighting for his own sorcerers, but for every psychically talented Astartes in the legions. Magnus was instrumental in developing the training and structure for the Space Marine librarians. He firmly believed that given enough time, he and the other librarians would be able to help humanity conquer the pitfalls of psychic abilities and begin a new age of knowledge and understanding. While Magnus did have some support, he also had incredibly vocal opponents. Leman Russ of Space Wolves had been making the greatest push towards the absolute ban of Psykers, while Rogaldorn and Mortarion would downright refuse to fight alongside the Thousand Sons or any other legions who used sorcery. Against him, the Sisters of Silence presented a list of atrocities brought upon helpless humans by corrupt psychic overlords. Examples of madness and mutations such as the chaos spawn that so many Thousand Sons battle brothers had regressed into. And everyone there knew all too well, especially Mortarion, of what a nightmare demon-possessed sorcerers could be. Magnus countered that the Thousand Sons had, at least for the most part, become the masters of all the arcane knowledge they had come across, and asked the Emperor not to ban Psykers, but to invest in them so that they could help humanity better understand how to control their abilities and allow them to continue contributing to the Imperium in the best way they knew how. I'm not going to go into the entire ordeal here, that'll be a video for another time. However, after hearing all these arguments, even from frontline Space Marine librarians, the Emperor issued his ruling. Quote, "Hear now the words of my ruling. I am not blind to the needs of the Imperium, but nor am I blind to the realities of the hearts of men. I hear men speak of knowledge and power as though they are abstract concepts to be employed as simply as a sword or gun. They are not. Power is a living force, and the danger within power is obsession. A man who attains a measure of power will find it comes to dominate his life until all he can think of is the acquisition of more. Nearly all men can stand adversity, but few can stand the ultimate test of character, that of wielding power without succumbing to its darker temptations. Peering into the darkness to gain knowledge of the warp is fraught with peril, for it is an inconstant place of shifting reality, capricious lies, and untruths. The seeker after truth must have a care he is not deceived, for false knowledge is more dangerous than ignorance. All men wish to possess knowledge, but few are willing to pay the price. Always, men will seek to take the shortcut, quick route to power, and it is a man's own mind, not his enemy or foe, that will lure him to evil ways. True knowledge is gained only after the acquisition of wisdom. Without wisdom, a powerful person does not become more powerful, he becomes reckless. His power will turn on him and eventually destroy all he has built. I have walked paths no man can know, and faced the unnameable creatures of the warp. I understand all too well the secrets and dangers that lurk in its hidden darkness. Such things are not for lesser minds to know, no matter how powerful or knowledgeable they believe themselves to be. The secrets I have shared served as warnings, not enticements to explore further. Only death and damnation await those who pry too deeply into secrets not meant for mortals. I see now that I have allowed my sons to delve too profoundly into matters I should never have permitted them to know even existed. Let it be known that no one shall suffer censure, for this conclave is to serve unity, not discord. But no more shall the threat of sorcery be allowed to taint the warriors of the Astartes. Henceforth, it is my will that no legion will maintain a librarius department. All its warriors and instructors must be returned to the battle companies and never again employ any psychic powers. Woe betide he who ignores my warning or breaks faith with me. He shall be my enemy. I will visit such destruction upon him and his follow till the end of all things. He shall rue the day he turned from my light." This effectively banned Psykers in the Imperium, except for government-sanctioned ones such as Astropaths and Navigator. Despite the Emperor's edict and grim warning, the Thousand Sons continued to gather forbidden knowledge from the worlds they conquered and held onto it for study and safekeeping. Fast forward a bit, and Magnus learns of Horuss's corruption by the powers of chaos. Ever loyal, Magnus knew he had to warn his father, but he also knew that sending a message through official channels would take too long and possibly not reach the Emperor in time. So, Magnus took it upon himself to reach out and connect to the Emperor mind to mind. At this point, the Emperor was holed up in his laboratory back on Terra in an effort to complete the Webway project, which would have allowed humanity to utilize the Eldari Webway and virtually eliminate the dependency on the warp for travel, communications, etc. He had succeeded in breaching the Webway, but had to use his immense psychic power to project powerful wards around the site and his lab in order to keep the demons of the warp from spilling into the palace. This unexpected forced call blasted through the Emperor's psychic defenses, killing thousands of people working on the project who were unable to handle Magnus's desperate and powerful influence. On top of that, the protective barriers surrounding the Webway entrance were also destroyed, allowing demons to pour through and attempt to invade the palace. They were beaten back by the Custodes and the Sisters of Silence and the Emperor himself, but the damage had been done. The Emperor was furious, to say the least. He refused to believe that Horuss could ever become a pawn of chaos, instead placing the blame upon Magnus. Since Magnus had done so much damage and blatantly used the psychic powers that the Emperor had expressly banned, he figured Magnus was attempting to deceive him. The Emperor ordered Leman Russ and the Space Wolves to go to the Thousand Sons' homeworld Prospero and bring Magnus and his legion back to Terra to answer for their crimes. However, this order was intercepted and changed by Horuss, who instead ordered Russ to destroy the Thousand Sons in Prospero. Magnus foresaw the assault on Prospero and Horuss's betrayal. At this moment, he realizes that he had been manipulated by the Chaos God Tzeentch, all this time. While attempting to save his legion from the flesh change and save the Imperium, he unknowingly consorted with the God of Change. Magnus understood the consequences of his actions, and in a last-ditch effort to prove his own loyalty and that of his legion, he didn't warn them of the upcoming assault. In fact, he made it easier for the Space Wolves to conduct their attack by sending his fleet away from Prospero and producing a psychic veil that prevented the other sorcerers from knowing what was coming. Magnus knew Tzeentch wanted the Thousand Sons and the Space Wolves to tear each other apart, and he wanted to do everything he could to disrupt those plans and prove to the Emperor that he and his legion were loyal to the end, even if that meant sacrificing his entire legion and himself to do so. Though the Thousand Sons were able to hold Tisca, the capital city of Prospero, for a time, they were eventually beaten back by the Space Wolves. After a pitched battle between Magnus and Leman Russ and their legions, a badly wounded Magnus invoked a ritual that transported him and his legion into the warp, where Tzeentch had prepared a demon world just for them, and Magnus was rewarded by Tzeentch by making him a demon prince. The Thousand Sons went on to fight during the Horuss Heresy, and afterward were once again falling victim to the flesh change mutation, this time in droves. Chief Librarian and bestie to Magnus, Ironmen, figured that he could fix this issue plaguing what was left of the Legion. Him and his conclave invoked a complex ritual, later known as the Rubric of Ironmen. The effects of the rubric were twofold. On one hand, the Thousand Sons sorcerers' power increased exponentially. Conversely, any battle brother lacking psychic abilities was instantly turned to dust within their armor. Regardless of which side they ended up on, the souls of the Thousand Sons legions were forever bound into their armor. Besides the sorcerers, the rest of the legion became mindless automatons known as Rubric Marines. And that brings us up to speed and to the gameplay side of things. I know that was a lot, and I tried to condense it down as much as possible, but the Thousand Sons and Magnus have so much lore, and it's such a great story. If you're looking to play an army, you should at least make sure they look cool, and one that you think has cool lore too. So you can run a Thousand Sons army in a couple different ways. You can go demon heavy with Zangors, or you can go rubric heavy. I'm going to talk about both, but mostly focus on a rubrics list, as that's how I prefer to run them. Let's talk about Zangors. These little dudes are pretty ass in terms of stats, but they're not half bad at clogging up objectives. They're equipped with an auto pistol and either chain swords or Zangor blades for melee, and they can be run as either 10 or 20 man squads for 65 to 130 points respectively. Now for the points cost, especially for a 20 model blob, that's pretty darn cheap. Zangors will certainly treat you better in the points economy area, and a 20 man block is going to be hard to move off of any objective, but this army excels the most when it can make maximum use of ritual casting. Rituals are a mechanic exclusive to Thousand Sons, where you can cast really beneficial spells that do shit like Mortal Wounds, which are wounds you can't usually save against, or adding 2 to someone's armor saves, or getting free extra movement. There are several to choose from, and each takes X amount of these things called Cabal points to cast. You gain Cabal points through a combination of abilities and character importance, and provided you have sorcerers and the like on the board, you'll regenerate these on each of your turns. I'll explain more about ritual casting and other faction abilities a little bit later in the video. With Zangors, you roll a d6 for each objective you control, and on a 4-up, you gain a Cabal point. This obviously relies on your ability to control objectives. Otherwise, you're relying on your character units to bring in those sweet Cabal points. This is the biggest downfall of running Zangors, in my opinion, as playing against an army like Tyranids or Necrons that also run blobs that are often better than yours can make gaining Cabal points a pain in the ass. I'm not saying you shouldn't run Zangors, but I prefer a bit more certainty to maximize my ability to cast rituals as much as possible. That is where Rubric Marines come into play. Rubrics are your only other main battle line unit and are slightly better than your average Space Marine squad. Made up of an aspiring sorcerer and 4 dusty boys, you're looking at running 5 and 10 man squads at 105 and 210 points. That's a significant jump in points over the Zangors, and rubrics will certainly take up a hefty chunk of your points budget. But the way I build my list after these guys is all about synergy and being able to throw down as many spells and as much gunfire as physically possible. There are a couple of reasons for that. One is that since your units are more expensive on average, you will almost always have several fewer models on the board than your opponent. Another is that rubrics can run either 2 bolters, a Soul Reaper cannon, chain gun, and a flamer, or all flamers or bolters. And lastly, regardless of size, every squad will generate 1 Cabal point thanks to their Aspiring Sorcerer. Rubrics can also reroll a wound roll of 1 thanks to their Bringers of Change ability, or the entire wound roll if they're in range of an objective. The reason you want to run Rubrics is 1. Volume of Fire, 2. Guaranteed Cabal points, and 3. Board coverage for ritual casting. The more squads you have and more spots on the board, the more likely you'll be able to effectively target something for a ritual and control the board state. I usually run 4 squads, 1 of 10 and 3 of 5. My 10 man is running all flamers and the rest are running bolters and a soul reaper. When it comes to our characters, let's start with the best Primarch in the game, Magnus the Red. Coming in at 440 points, Magnus is an expensive but must-have pick for larger games. His points cost makes sense when you look at his stats, attacks, and abilities. Not only does he hit like a truck, he has a little bit of board control with his abilities, and I'll drop those right here so you can pause and check those out. Most importantly, he generates a whopping 4 Cabal points. Now, I will warn you that he will become an immediate target for your opponent. You can play Magnus a few different ways, being as how he has the deep strike ability. You can smack him down just about anywhere, or have him lead from the front. He can be pretty disgusting for your opponents to deal with. Next up, we have an Infernal Master, Exalted Sorcerer, Terminator Sorcerer, and Ironmen. The Infernal Master, Exalted, and Terminator will all generate you 2 Cabal points a pop, and Ironmen will get you 3 more. With the Infernal Master, you've got a pretty nasty ranged attack, and his abilities give his units sustained 1, meaning that rolling a 6 on your hit roll counts as an additional hit. And once per turn, you can change the result of any hit, wound, or save roll to an auto pass. He costs 115 points, but for an extra 25, you can give him the Arcane Vortex enhancement that adds 1 to his strength and damage characteristics. Moving on to our Exalted Sorcerer. You got 2 versions you can run, either on a disc of Tzeentch or without the disc. This one is really going to come down to preference, but I prefer running him without the disc. He's a little bit cheaper in points, and he has a more valuable utility. Your disc guy is going to run you 105 points, and like most spellcasters on this list, has pretty nasty weapon blocks. His 2 abilities give his unit a 4-up invuln, which will help your Rubrics last a lot longer on the field compared to their default 5, and with the Mighty Tendrils ability, you can select 1 enemy unit, excluding monsters and vehicles, that was hit with his Arcane Fire attack and pin them down. While pinned, your opponent must subtract 2 from movement and charges made for that unit. That's pretty cool and all. For 100 points, you can run the guy without the disc. Again, pretty freaky attack blocks, but the abilities are what we want to pay attention to. He also gives his squad a 4-up invuln save, which, as a reminder, can always be used in place of your default save characteristic if you're hit with attacks that make your default ineffective or just take away your saves entirely. Anyway, the special thing here is the Rebind Rubricae ability that allows you to return a couple rubrics to your squad in your command phase. To do so, you roll a d6, and on a 2 to 5, you bring back 1. On a 6, you bring back 2. Do be careful not to roll a 1, as that deals d3 damage to this guy, and that can be extremely crippling, being as how he has just 5 wounds. For an extra 20 points, you can give him the Athenium Scrolls enhancement, which will let you generate an additional Cabal point, provided he isn't battle shocked. Your Sorcerer in Terminator armor is the tankiest outside of Magnus and comes in at 150 points. His anti-vehicle monster attack is pretty nifty, and his abilities grant his units lethal hits on all weapons, as well as giving your units rerolls on hit rolls of 1 against a designated target within 18 inches of invisible to that psyker. For 35 more points, you can give this guy the Lord of Forbidden Lore enhancement, which allows him to cast a ritual that's already been cast once again, provided you have the Cabal points to do so. Finally, we've got Ironmen. Like the Exalted, you can run him on a disc or on foot. That'll run you 140 and 130 points respectively, but both have the same stats across the board, save for the extra movement you get from the disc. His abilities allow his unit to add 1 to the wound rolls they make, and once per battle, Ironmen can cast a ritual for free. However, keep in mind that you can still only cast said ritual if it hasn't already been cast that turn. Moving on to the last bits of our list, we've got 3 units we can toss in here. The Mutilith Vortex Beast, Scarab Terminators, Thousand Suns Vindicator Tank. The Vortex Beast, while being a complete and total pain in the ass to build, is invaluable for any Thousand Suns list, but particularly ones that focus heavy on ritual casting like this one. I'm not kidding, get this thing pre-built. This is an older kit, the instructions suck, and most of the pieces don't actually fit together very well. Save yourself some time and some headache. Anyway, this thing is pretty good. Stat blocks are all solid, and when it comes to attacks, you've got 3 to choose from, giving you a solid option for just about any situation. It can hold its own in melee easily enough, although I'd recommend a Mauler Fiend or other dedicated melee unit if you want something a bit more consistent in that category. This dude has a 5-up Feel No Pain save, and its abilities allow you to double the range for ritual casting for any psyker that is within 6 inches of it, which can make casting something crazy like Doom Bolt much more dangerous, as well as this neat little thing called Mutating Vortex, which at the end of your movement phase lets you roll a d6 for each enemy unit within 6 inches of the vortex piece. On a 2 to 3, that enemy unit suffers a mortal wound. On a 4 to 5, d3 mortal wounds, and on a 6, it suffers a potentially devastating 6 mortal wounds. On top of that, each enemy unit within range of that ability has to make a battle shock test. For 150 points, this is a spectacular unit to throw in any T-Suns list. Optimally, you'd want to have more than one for coverage purposes, but this list works with one pretty well. Scarab Terminators are like regular Space Marine Terminators, but better in every way, and at least in my personal experience, a lot harder for opponents to kill. Coming in at 190 points, they are a bit pricey, but they can take either a Soul Reaper and Heavy Flamer and a Hellfire Missile Rack to really beef up their range capability. These fellas generate you a Cabal point, and with their ability, anytime an attack is made against them while their Psyker is still alive, if the strength of that attack is greater than their toughness, your opponent must subtract 1 from their wound roll, essentially making these guys much harder to get rid of. Just like their loyalist counterparts, they have combi bolters, but this time with AP, and they have the deep strike capability, allowing you to plop these dudes close to or even on top of a valuable objective and keep them there. Finally, we've got the Vindicator. This list, and Thousand Suns in general, lack a decent heavy hitter and are sort of weak to enemy armor. Well, that's where the Vindicator comes in. At 175 points, this tank is very cheap and a very effective answer to enemy armor and heavy units. Its Demolisher Cannon can one-tap just about anything if it rolls halfway decently, and it's got its fair share of anti-infantry weapons as well. Now, this thing is no Predator or Repulsor, but it gets the job done. With its Siege Shield ability, the Vindicator can fire its main gun while engaged in melee with other models and not take any negatives from doing so. That'll make your enemies think twice about getting up close, believe me. So with all that said, how does it all tie together? So let's go back to the faction specific rules. At the start of each of your command phases, you can select a buff for your psychic attacks. Similar to Templar vows, they'll affect every Thousand Suns unit with the added benefit of being able to switch them up throughout the game, whereas with something like Templar vows, you're stuck with one for the whole thing. You can choose either lethal hits, sustained 1, or devastating wounds, which makes 6s on wound rolls unable to be saved against in most circumstances. Some of these will be redundant on a unit or 2, but for the most part, you can usually stack them with whatever keyword the psychic attack already has, such as stacking lethals with the sustained hits that the Infernal Master has, giving you guaranteed wounds on 6s to hit, and a freebie which also guarantees a wound. With this list, you'll have more than enough Cabal points to pull off some seriously nasty ritual combos. Rituals, like stratagems, have conditions on use. Some will be used at the start of your shooting phase like Doom Bolt, others will allow you to reroll a failed save or grant extra movement. This particular list will run you about 2,005 points, and has a very heavy focus on hitting extremely hard and maximizing spellcasting. It's particularly weak to armies with several precision options such as Necron Death Marks. They can eliminate your sorcerers and thereby reduce your Cabal points. It's also pretty weak to heavy hitter and vehicle lists, so make sure you strategize and make maximum use of cover and stratagems like Destined by Fate, Devastating Sorcery, and Ensorceraled Fusion. Now let's break that down a little bit. Destined by Fate allows you to change the damage characteristic of an attack that got through to 0 for just 1 CP. Essentially, you're just going nuh-uh whenever somebody damages a model you really like. Devastating Sorcery allows you to reroll attack and wound rolls for that unit. Ensorceraled Fusion grants the psychic keyword to bolt and combi weapons in a unit, changes their strength to 5, and allows you to get your Cult of Magic buffs that we talked about earlier, potentially giving you a massive increase to your damage dealing capabilities. In my last similar video, I did an estimate on cost. I'll do the same here, but I'm going to keep it a bit shorter because this one is a little different. So I built the bulk of my army with 2 boxes, the Boarding Patrol and the Court of the Crimson King. Both of these give you a substantial number of rubric, a couple of chaos spawn, which are great to plop on your home objective or pedalist out with, and Magnus himself. Both of these, at the time I bought them, ran $122 for the Boarding Patrol and $307 for the Court of the Crimson King, both on Amazon. My Vindicator is printed, and you can find STLs for that in a lot of different places. Scarab Terminators will run you $53 roughly on Amazon. The Vortex Beast I got on eBay for about $80, and that's a really hard kit to find, so expect to pay a little more for it especially if you do pre-build. But finally, Ironmen will run you about 40 bucks. All in all, you're looking at around $602 if you build it using the kits I did. I've got no idea what the Crimson King box set is going for right now, so don't hold me to the price on that one. And that's all I've got for this one, y'all. The Thousand Sons are my second big army behind my Templars, and I've got around 3,500 points worth of models for them. I love these Dusty Boys and their lore, and so I really wanted to put them in the spotlight and show just how cool they are and how insane they could be on the tabletop. But let me know what you thought in the comments. How do you play Thousand Sons, and what do you think of the 15th Legion and Magnus? Drop a like if you like it, subscribe if you really liked it, and be sure to check my community tab to keep up to date on shitposts and shenanigans. Magnus did nothing wrong, and I'll see you all in the next one. Toodles.